Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 11 of Culture Talks. We are absolutely delighted to be joined with the wonderful Louise McGeady from Opal People Solutions. And the conversation today is going to be a great one. Make sure you watch all the way through. And let's just get straight into it. Louise, we're delighted to have you here. We wanted to have you here from before we even started these. You were one of the first people that came to mind. And just wanted to give you an opportunity to briefly introduce yourself. Obviously, for those who don't know you, you're a human resources consultant. You work with many different organizations doing fantastic work. But you want to give us a wee bit of an intro, a bit of a pitch, I suppose, for yourself, so that I make sure we're giving you as much justified chance to share yourself.
Sure. Yes, I've been a HR consultant now for 5 years. Starting off as a part-time position whilst I built the business, and now 2 years on my own completely. I probably would have described myself as a HR generalist because I've been a jack of all trades essentially throughout most of my career. And starting in your own business, you don't really want to refuse any business, so you kind of do any work for anybody at any price.
Yep.
And then when you really try and explore the whole concept of niche and understanding where you add most value and what energizes you most, where I fit within that HR function, although as I say, absolutely generalist and still provide a range of services, but I sit within the employee relations aspect of HR, so the disciplinaries, grievances, restructures, absence management, change management, all those sort of fields.
All the sort of roll your sleeves up and get stuck in type stuff.
In fairness, I probably resisted it a bit because that's where the risk is to me personally and my business if I give wrong advice. With what you guys do in the whole engagement and culture side of things, you're not going to end up in tribunal with that.
Yeah. I suppose that's where it takes somebody like yourself with the experience that you have to protect everybody in all cases, and I think it's important before we hit record there, we were having a really good chat about the fact that the role that human resources plays within culture and how it's important to understand that everybody has a role to play, but you were saying that not everybody's going to be 100% happy, and it's about trying to move in that direction. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, we all experience culture very, very differently, depending on what your role is in the organisation. And what we were chatting about earlier is the employee attitude surveys. They can be fairly fickle because literally a refusal of a holiday the day before will impact upon those results. And in my particular roles, particularly in the last organisation that I worked in, I was in a senior leadership role within that organisation. So I was involved in making decisions, that obviously would impact on culture.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to, whilst engaging with your staff and building really good culture, should be everybody's ideal, and it should be the goal that we all set each other. Sometimes there are situations that need to be dealt with within an organisation, and that means the work that you want to do in culture has to be paused until you can get a structure, for example, that's fit for purpose. And certainly we did that very successfully in the last organisation because we gave managers some teeth and we held them accountable for what they were delivering. And fundamentally, we actually put the people management aspect, take HR aside, the responsibility for people management we devolved to line management level. And that was how I was able to start my business, because I effectively kind of half made myself redundant because the managers became so proficient in dealing with their people. And that was significant step change in our culture, because the benchmark engagement survey that we would have conducted was a very, very low number. And we fully anticipated that would be the case. We started a process of change management and did an organisational restructure. And when you come out the other end of that, every single year there was significant step change in the engagement indicators. But there was a lot of pain that people potentially went through to get to that point. And sometimes you have to sacrifice a bit of pain now for long-term results. And fundamentally, what we found that the major change is having one manager that you are accountable to, and that person is responsible for your whole journey in that employment situation.
Yeah.
So from my point of view, I was highly energized because I knew what the plan was. I was involved in putting it together, and for the execution of the organisational restructure, if that's not an incorrect word to use actually, but you know, ultimately there would have been people that were impacted directly by that restructure, negatively as well as positively.
Yeah.
I mean, that's obviously change is difficult. Nobody really likes change. It's just not natural to us. So, and obviously you have an important role to play with that. I mean, in my own past, I'd have been guilty, I'd say, and in all honesty, until I actually really met you and listened to how you dealt with things and your approach to it, I would have had a bit of a negative opinion of HR in terms of culture, that because I think a lot of people do use it in a negative way. And there are some HR consultants that I've known of in the past who just didn't seem to really, they didn't care about the culture all that much. And actually speaking to you and getting to know you better was very refreshing in terms of that, because you do have such a sway towards culture. And that's obviously coming from that background that we talk about. I mean, we all have to accept, obviously, there are difficult decisions that have to be made. And unfortunately, you're sometimes left in the most difficult position within that as well. But what is your opinion of that? I mean, do you feel that there is a bit of a negative sway towards HR in general?
I mean, I would certainly be a member of the number of forums, and I would see an awful lot of feedback on LinkedIn where people's experience of HR hasn't always been positive. You know, whether that comes down to that they've told them something confidentially and it has been leaked, or, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, if you are subject to disciplinary procedures, you're probably not going to have a very positive view of HR. And, you know, for me, even though I talk about that is my niche and that's where I add most value, you can still treat people with respect. You can still carry out the process sensitively, sympathetically, and with empathy, but ultimately, you know, there is a point in time where a tough decision potentially has to be made.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that what you mentioned, Louise, about when a change management process is going on, that the best results come from whenever you have a direct line manager or some of the senior manager who you report to and who report to you. And I think for me that really sings true to the relationships that can be built up, that the sort of professionalism and the personal side of things can come into play. Like Sean mentioned, no one likes change, but if you have somebody who's a friendly face who you know cares, and they're also going through that change and they have your best interest at heart, from a managerial perspective and a personal perspective, it takes a bit of the sting out of it, especially if you can level with somebody.
Yeah.
You know, sorry, Sean, I keep going to cut across here.
I was just going to say, I mean, one of the things you point out, I mean, for us, I suppose there is a slightly easier element to it, because, I mean, even in the past, in terms of, like, we're actually in the management roles, we have sort of sweat a bit of dependency on the HR side, because there is a lot of the stuff that isn't nice to do or be involved in, and sometimes it is nice to be able to pass that on to someone else and do some of the nice cultural stuff. And we're very much aware that there are circumstances where things need to change and people just aren't fit for that position. It doesn't suit them. So I agree with 100% just on that bit, that we sort of do, I suppose, have a bit of an easier way forward. I suppose that we can shift that on to somebody else. But obviously, Louise, you're doing a lot of stuff. I mean, one of the posts I seen you put on the other day there was looking positively on how things can move forward, particularly the circumstances now with COVID. That your post the other day that you had on was that, you know, people will automatically, I suppose, panic maybe. I mean, people don't always mean bad by doing these things, but people will maybe panic and rush to let employees go, because we always find, and I've always found this in the past, that people, when they try to cut costs of the bottom line, they automatically go to the team members. Yeah. But you're saying you have a different perspective on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, My objective is to try and avoid redundancies wherever we possibly can. And it's not just about the individual organisation that I'm potentially working with. I'm looking at the economy as a whole, and what happens when, you know, hundreds of thousands of people are unemployed, and what does that do, you know, socially, particularly, you know, I actually, in the post, I talked about, and I actually looked up the definition of redundancy, and it's basically that feeling of being useless and not needed anymore. And that psychologically, that's a terrible way of feeling. And fundamentally, I think the furlough scheme essentially kicked the can down the road in many respects. So it gave some organisations that had to naturally shut the opportunity to potentially open again whilst retaining those staff. But in reality, there are multiple industries that are currently still resourced to pre-COVID levels, because the government is funding the salaries to 80% at this point in time. But on the 3rd of July, for example, is everybody going to be banging down the doors of clubs and restaurants and pubs, etc., and hotels to get in? There will still be people who have that fear factor and who will stay away, but that organisation is still resourced to the pre-COVID level. And the obvious thing for most organisations will be, right, we need to cut our staff by 20%. And there are other ways of doing that. And so I'm involved with 3 organisations right at this point in time, looking at what the situation is within their organisation and how can we avoid as far as possible redundancy. And of course that option is always going to be on the table, it has to be. But one organisation that we're talking to at the minute is a 5-day-a-week operation, and we're looking at, if they expanded their service to a 7-day operation, how would that impact on the role? So essentially you create more work to spread these hours out. There are other options we've looked at with some other clients where, for example, childcare hasn't fully opened up again. We don't know, and I'm sure Diane can talk to us and give us the latest information in terms of where childcare is at this point in time. But a lot of people maybe had parents that were their childcare providers, so they don't have the ability to turn off and turn on daycare options. So some of those people, for example, could take term time. So they will agree not to work during those summer months, and that takes that cost. You know, the objective is for these organisations, they need to reduce cost. That person, their cost has been completely eliminated from the organisation. However, their skills have been retained. And for me, that's critical, because I think an awful lot of the sectors that we're talking about will come back. But it could take 3, 6, 9 months, maybe a year. And if you can retain as much of the skills that you've built up, I think also in terms of culture and loyalty and engagement, there's a lot more to be said for an organisation that has absolutely looked at every other option that they possibly consider. And so what we're talking about to organisations is, if they expect, particularly the restaurant sector, they probably expect that they will have a 40% capacity, because obviously they've had their seating areas reduced to a certain extent. Plus as well, the footfall probably isn't going to be where it was back in February, March. So we're saying, if you expect your business to be operating at 40% capacity, then let's take the existing hours, and flexible furlough is fantastic for giving you the ability to do that, because that almost overrides what your contract says. In ordinary circumstances, you wouldn't get away with this. Flexible furlough is ideal, because if everybody is resourced to 40%, so they might work 10 hours out of their 40, for example, but the other 32 will be still paid at furlough rate. So they'll get 10 hours at the basic rate, 30 hours at 80%. And ultimately furlough will run out. And some organisations, my contracts of employment already had the short-time working and temporary layoff written in, so there's a contractual ability for employers to reduce hours of work without having to necessarily go through the 28-day consultation process. But even for those organisations that don't have it, I think if we see flexibility from the organisations in trying to do their level best to protect employment, what I am advocating is that that kind of pain is spread across all employees. Instead of us losing 5 members of a 20-person team, but we all take a 20% reduction in hours. And I'm not talking about reduction in pay, I'm talking about temporary reduction in hours. And as and when the business picks up, their hours get increased until such times there's a backup at their contracted hours. I think in many cases, if we say, right, we need to take you a 20% reduction in pay, typically that 20% never comes back. Whereas when you reduce the hours, you've still achieved the same thing. You reduce that cost, but there is always an objective to get the people back up to their contracted hours as quickly as possible. So I'm hoping that the employees will see the rationale of that, because you know, a lot of the success of what I'm trying to do with clients will very much depend on how the employees react to it. So within, I have changed the emphasis, and I call it right sizing. So a phrase that would have been used before, obviously redundancy or downsizing. For me, it's about getting the right resources at this point. And that is always going to be a fluid picture until you kind of say, right, well, that's probably where we are now. And there may be redundancies at that point in time, or you'll potentially have natural wastage where somebody moves on. You know, maybe the reduction in those hours don't suit that particular individual, and they move on to another organisation who's able to offer more hours. But that's the kind of logic of what I'm trying to do with this whole right sizing, and within that, you know, we listen. We typically talk to our clients on a Zoom call, understand and explore all the options at that point in time. Write the business case, which is a very important document. You know, obviously there's a risk here that there's potentially tribunal proceedings at the end of it. We always have to keep that in the back of our mind. It's not something I major on, but it is a reality. So that document stipulates all the things that you've considered, because the tribunal will want to know that you didn't just jump in and redundancy be the first option. And you know, we produce all the consultation documents, the announcement to the staff, you know, if we do have to do redundancy, we'll work through the selection criteria and apply fair method of selection in that. And then whether it's new contracts that we issue, because we've potentially changed some of the terms and conditions or done a temporary change, or whether there is confirmation of redundancy, we do all that, and we handhold the organisation through the whole consultation process with them. So we're with everybody at each step of that journey.
Yeah, it is tough. For leaders and organisations, it is a tough scenario, and that is why it's good to have somebody like yourself who can walk you through that. Because I mean, we've been in management for a long time, and I know thankfully we didn't face anything of this calibre before. I mean, at the start of this, we thought we were having to basically let people go, and thankfully a week later that changed. It was absolutely awful period of time. So I don't envy anybody who is left in that position, but obviously just taking the right advice and making the right decisions. And I think anybody who had a positive culture moving into this, I think it's a lot easier to find that kind of balance between the leaders of the organisation and the rest of the team as well, because people will be understanding of the circumstances if relationships were good beforehand. If there was issues beforehand, I think it just makes it a lot more difficult.
Yeah, I think it's fair to sorry, Louise. I think it's fair to say that, like, people that you and people in the field that you're in, as Sean said, I remember being in positions where you don't know what to do for the best, when even pre-COVID, and when you're dealing with difficult circumstances with employees, and you want the best result for everybody, one that's going to not impact the team in a negative way, not impact that person, more importantly, who's in the situation. And I think that sometimes, depending on the intention of all those involved, especially the person who's leading the way from the HR function, I believe sometimes you can be the unsung heroes, because as Sean says, you get to a point as a manager where you don't know what to do, and there's a throw up between what's legal and what's right and what's right for that person. And I think you touch upon those points really beautifully when you say that, you know, sometimes difficult decisions have to be made. You want to exhaust all options before it gets to a point where, unfortunately, somebody may have to be made redundant, or in the case that I'm referring to, maybe somebody has to be let go because of a reason. But as Sean said there, it does come down to relationships. I think that there's, you know, whether it's with that person to explain to them we don't have any other option, or if it's with the rest of the team off the back of a hard decision made, whether it's redundancy or somebody let go. I think that it's about those relationships that can make or break the organization's culture, because we use the word culture quite a bit, and I think sometimes people might look at it and say, like, for us in this conversation, we know what we mean by culture, but sometimes people watch this and I think it becomes a key word or a buzzword. And for what it really truly comes down to is the environment that people work in and the relationships within that environment. And I think that human resources is always going to be something that, unfortunately, in some organizations, it'll be used as the reason to get away with making a harsh decision. But for the most part, the real essence of it is the step-by-step, like you said, Sean, the step-by-step on how to treat people with respect and use those relationships to make the changes in a way that fits everybody's acceptance, for lack of a better way to describe it.
Like, one of the other things you mentioned there was about, you know, how these things are done with people, you know, even if it is a redundancy. And one of the things I've been critical of in the past are those letters that I've seen going out to the team members who have lost their job, and it just seems like a good employee made a mistake and it's like kick you when you're down kind of thing. Is that the sort of, I know obviously there's a legal side to it and things have to be worded obviously in a certain way. Is there room for maneuver on that in terms of data? I mean, I know I've kind of shifted that direction, but I probably edge on the side of risk in terms of that, just because I want things to look right for the team and feel right for the team in terms of culture. So I'm kind of saying, was I doing things right or wrong? Is there a certain template you kind of have to follow?
Are we talking here the template, the redundancy letter, or are we talking a dismissal letter?
Well, the particular one I have in mind is dismissal, but I suppose all of them really.
I guess a lot comes down to maturity and in your role and in terms of your experience of HR. I mean, probably when I started out, it was, you know, something to the effect of, having considered all the evidence, there were no mitigating circumstances, so you're dismissed. And it was, you know, the brevity was actually quite ridiculous, because you were probably afraid of putting something in the letter which would potentially incriminate yourself down the line.
Yeah.
However, now, I mean, my grievance outcome letter, the most recent one I did was 9 pages long. And that's because I want to explain everything that I've considered, and how I reflected upon that, and how I came to the decision that I did on a point-by-point basis.
Yeah, that's fair.
You owe people that. You know, if I was doing a dismissal letter, they're kind of 2 to 3 pages long. The same thing, we will go through every part of it, and a lot of the dismissals that I'm probably involved in, they're not just one thing, they're a multitude of other factors and other allegations. So I think it's important to go through again and respond to each point in terms of, what did you say in your defence, what did we take into consideration, and why did we come to the view that we did. So again, when you take that time, and you're very much writing to a person. I'm not writing a legal letter as such. I'm writing a response to an individual. And ultimately, when we talked about change management and how open we are to change management, I'm as resistant to change as the best of them. I mean, I have been working probably since January, February time around branding, and obviously it took a pause. I started off by looking for one of your pop-up banners, and this hit, and I kind of thought, don't think we're going to be needing pop-up banners now for a while. At any speaking events other than online in this forum. So I got dragged kicking and screaming, and you saw the post yesterday, which was very much the graphics around right size.
Yeah, it looks excellent. It looks really good.
Funnily enough, I mean, I could spend 2-3 hours writing a post because I've 1,600 words and I have to get it down to 13.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to get across, and that's
Yeah.
incredibly difficult. And with this branding, guys, I'm not closed. I just can't visualize how you're going to get a post like that into a visual format. I literally banged something out in 20 minutes and said, "This is what I'm thinking about." And he literally took those words and put them word for word into 3 different graphics. And I thought, I like it. But you still go through that curve. So when we're talking about change management, I mean, I very much take the view you have everything thought out. I mean, you should never invoke any change management process without understanding what's the impact going to be for the organization and what's the impact going to be for the individual. And I'm very, very conscious of speaking politically correct as well, but if kind of the end justifies the means, and I mean that in the nicest possible way, but for the vast good of the organisation and the people at the other side of change management, if that is the route that you have to go, have everything prepared. And once you kind of press the button and make the decision, right, we're making the announcement, I think the quicker you go through that process, easier it is on all, because if you leave people in that dip and the kind of a disbelief and non-acceptance, the longer you allow them to stay in that place. Whereas if you move through the process quite quickly, you bring the people out to the other end in a much quicker method than you would otherwise. So even in this kind of redundancy, and we're talking, some people potentially have quite long length of service, therefore it's long notice periods. So are you really going to keep people employed for 10 weeks, having told them you're making them redundant at the end of it? Or is it kind of actually to the individual and better for the organisation to make a decision and pay them the lieu of notice? And I understand, of course, there are cost implications in that, but how much value are you going to get from that employee? How engaged are they to deliver anything for you once they're in period?
Yeah, especially when motivation is something that organizations work tirelessly on to, and we've come across this before in the past. I know you'll agree with me, Sean, but it's crazy to think that you could ask somebody to take that information, which has a vast impact on their lives, especially long service, people who have been in it 20, 30, maybe more sometimes cases, years, and then all they're going to think about is, what am I going to do off the back of this? Whereas it doesn't take the sting out altogether, but it at least promotes that there has been a relationship, that there's dignity, that they want to give you respect, being a big part of that, and that you have time and a little bit of, I suppose time is the best way to describe it, that you have time there with a little bit of extra cash in your pocket to let it. And I think it's also important for organizations to support people in those scenarios as well, and to help them through it, even if there's no obligation, I suppose, once they're not in contract anymore, but keep up some sort of connection with them to show that there's no hard feelings. I would imagine in the most cases people want that connection, but it's still nice to be seen from a cultural perspective, to want to keep that going and to want to support them post position.
This is such a difficult situation, because sometimes organizations go through redundancy processes potentially through mismanagement themselves. In this case, the employee is not to blame, but neither is the employer. It is not anybody's fault, and it's just incredibly difficult to have to go through that process. And yes, in normal circumstances, JP, you would do some sort of outplacement and help with CVs and help finding jobs. That's the worst thing about this, is that market is going to be saturated now.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's people, I see them on LinkedIn doing giving activities, you know, saying, look, I will look over your CV for you, or I will have a word with some of my connections, you know, get you registered with a particular agency within a sector. There's a lot of good help out there, but realistically, there, you know, in other, I mean, I did redundancy probably last October, and the market was really, really good, you know, so people weren't even, as you say, with a couple of pound in their pocket, but probably going to walk into a job as soon as they're registered with an agency, you know,
Yeah.
potentially they're into a job in a couple of days. The buoyancy of the market just isn't there at the minute. Which is another reason, as I say, why I'm trying different approaches. You know, are you better off getting 60% of your wages than 0% of your wages ultimately?
When I spoke to somebody recently as well, and that what you said is just what she had sort of said as well. And unfortunately, she's stuck in a position where she was having to speak to her team, and people were going to be let go. It's travel, and just a difficult circumstance. And obviously, you know, the business has to survive for the greater good of everybody. So that has to be the priority. And unfortunately, people will be casualties of what happens in that. But for her, she was completely devastated. And you just hope that the people who are unfortunately left in that circumstance where they may be losing their job, that they do have some understanding of the position that the leaders are in as well, because it's difficult, really, really difficult circumstance, you say, for them too. And she was trying to do her best. She was looking at CVs and things as well to support people. But again, kind of knowing what you're saying, you know, you may have a great CV, but if there's no employment there, it's very, very difficult. But that's not the same. I mean, it's still a great thing to do, because of course work will come at some point, and if people continue to push forward as well, there is a positive to come out of it in the end. And sometimes it works out better for people as well, which you have to remember. But it's important for organizations to try, as you say, and retain people. Like, that retention piece is just so important, because I think in the short term, people are obviously cost saving, but in the long term, not maybe thinking about how much it actually costs bringing people on board to replace these people you've just lost. And what you've actually lost, the experience you've lost, the efficiency. You know, you lose so much when you lose a good person, and trying to replace them just costs you a fortune. It's not worthwhile.
The other point is, you know, if you have to reduce your workforce by half potentially, and a lot of those people have long service, and you haven't had any income for the past 4 or 5 months, how do you afford the redundancy costs?
Yeah.
And that has to be a factor in you know, trying to come up with alternatives, because you know, who in this climate can afford 30 grand off their bottom line to pay redundancy costs, and yet there's a moral obligation and a legal obligation to do that.
Yeah, no, totally agree. One of the unique situations starting to emerge, I suppose, is the idea of remote working. So I think before COVID hit and lockdown came about, I think probably 90% of people didn't even know what Zoom was, and overnight it seems it's as if it's always been there. And I know that whether people know or not, but we the three of us actually have a relationship with a great company, HR Locker, and they've been promoting the idea of remote working and being able to use their system to effectively manage your people through the hours that they're spending on the work they're doing. And I know you'll have a fair bit to say, because you've been using that system for a while now. Louise, could you try and give a wee bit of an idea of what it is and maybe how it can impact you positively?
Sure. I started my relationship with HR Locker about 2.5, 3 years ago now. Obviously, you know, in any HR consultancy role, the difference in me and another consultant is me and that other consultant. You know, we're probably all of the same level of competence, you know, but it comes down to just that kind of connection that you make with clients. And obviously I was starting to probably at that stage of thinking of going out 100% on my own, and wanted to find something that differentiated me from other HR consultants. And it really came about by one client asking me to source HR software for them. And I'd spent a considerable amount of time, got 3 demos in front of them, and I said, no, actually, we want the fair employment report as well. And there was only one company that did the fair employment report. And then they said, do you know, I think we really need to do all sorts of diversity. You know, we probably need to monitor how much disabled employees we have, what's the sex or the gender balance within the organisation, what's the racial balance, you know, so ensuring that you're completely diverse and inclusive.
Yeah.
So I used some of my connections and asked questions. Who do you know? What Irish companies do you know that would be willing to work with me to develop this module? Because the other option was cost prohibitive for the organisation. So I met with Adam Coleman, who's the CEO of HR Logger, surfer dude, completely. Completely open to working with me, had considered it before. They're a company based in Lynch in County Clare, so obviously a fair employment report that only affects Northern Ireland, so a much smaller group of potential clients for them, but still in all he could see some potential, and it worked out very, very well for them, because then gender pay gap reporting came in the UK. We don't have it yet in Northern Ireland, but that came in the UK, so this report is ideally designed to do that for the organisations. So very much, I mean, I don't, I hope Adam and Ellie aren't listening, but I don't actively go out, you know, I don't sell my own services, so I would find it really, really hard to sell somebody else's service, and I don't want to be seen that I'm pushing expenditure and cost onto clients, particularly in this current situation. However, you know, it's an absolutely fantastic tool from the point of view that, first and foremost, it's primarily self-service. So yep. From a management perspective and an admin perspective, very little I have to do and very little the client has to do, because a lot of the changes that happen within the system is employee instigated. You know, so it has all the functionality that I would want of a system, and it's exceptionally easy to navigate, because you've got a header along the top that tells you exactly the field that you're in, and there's only one kind of subheading within that, so you can't get lost. I've had a system that I used to work with, and I got so deep into it I couldn't figure out how I get back to the place that I want to be. And yeah. Particularly, you know, my clients don't have HR, hence the reason why they employ me. So they don't want to be dealing with any kind of cumbersome product. Yeah. But fundamentally, the best thing about it is the price. It's very, very competitively priced.
Massively, yeah.
You know, two clients that I had mentioned it kind of in passing, of saying, you know, for example, one found it very hard getting contracts issued. And this is, you know, you upload it, the employee can see everything. You know, some fields are restricted, obviously, but by and large, you know, so they see their contract, they read their contract, and they digitally sign. So there's no more issue chasing people to get the contracts back. You can see who has signed it. The employee can clock in on an app on their phone. You can see exactly where they clocked in. So if they were running down the street at 9 o'clock, you can see that they were running down the street at 9 o'clock. And you can approve all of their hours, and that goes straight to payroll. So immediately, there's the error cost that is taken out of it, and there's the double entry cost that's taken out of the whole payroll side of things. On the engagement side of things, and I know you guys will have come across this multiple times, one of the biggest engagement issue is having holidays not responded to. So it's not even that you turned it down, it's that you've put in a holiday request and nobody has come back to you on that. Within this system, the employee can go in and see Sean and JP are off, so they know not to request that holiday. So if they pick the week after, the manager goes in, yep, nobody else off, approved, end of. That's as, you know, difficult now as holiday requests are within that system. But it is brilliant for the whole training, and there's a lot of organisations that have mandatory training. So many times in every organisation, we have missed the first aid training. So if you do it within the 3-year period, they only have to do a day's refresher. And inevitably, you miss that. This system picks up everything, sends reminders. I mean, obviously, you have to program that into it and then the setup, but there's no excuse for anything being missed. And a big frustration of mine is clients coming to me and saying, we're struggling with this individual, we've tried working with them, they're still within their probation period, and I think we're going to have some conversations. And you say, so it's a 6-month probation period, yeah, and they're with, oh, it was last week.
I think we've been there ourselves, Louise.
And that's incredibly frustrating. I mean, a probation period isn't a carte blanche to do whatever you want to do with an employee, but there is some sort of protection within that period of time, and inevitably the person gets out of probation period before it's picked up. That won't happen if you're using HR Locker.
Yeah.
Like one of the things that attracted us to it actually was the part you were just saying there as well, but it kind of is empowerment piece for employees as well, because there's probably when in request meetings or request training, and obviously the training side of that and the real-time reviews we love about it too.
Yeah.
I cannot have the tick box exercises because that's all they are. You know, the cup of coffee, the talking about a rubbish, the relationship building, and then talking about some work-related issues. And just recording that conversation has taken place is of so much more value. I mean, I have remembered multiple times you're panicking at going in for that yearly conversation. A lot of times your pay increase is going to be based on it. So you go say some of the struggles that you're having or some of the areas you don't think you've performed terribly well and you need help with. Absolutely not. Because there will be judgments made. So, you know, a cup of coffee once a quarter, that, you know, you don't have to spend 4 hours in that conversation. Half an hour, go off site, even better. You know,
that's the thing about that, but isn't it? You know, if you're having that conversation regular, it doesn't have to be a long conversation, because you've normally, like we talk about development chats, and that's what we would do. We always kind of say little and often, so little time spent on each one, but do each one often. And you normally find that a lot of times we'd have called the team members in and kind of said, you know, going to have a chat, how are you getting on? You find there are no problems. You know, they don't have any issues, you don't have any issues. 5 minutes, it's slow, how you doing, and off they go again. And of course you're chatting through shifts and all anyway, but I think definitely I'd like to see that yearly appraisal. I've never had one, and I just can't stand the idea of it.
Yeah, no, I think with the current, like, so a lot of people are reaching out to us now and saying, how do you build culture remotely? And I think that having a tool, well, first and foremost, engagement is huge. You have to make sure you're keeping a clear line of communication with your team members within the organization. And I think that HR Locker, that's why we even looked at it. We because you had mentioned it to us before, and we looked at it, and we're happy to say now we'll actively promote organizations and looking at taking it on as a piece of software that they can use, because a lot of like I said at the start there, about Zoom and you know, a lot of organizations have done everything paperwork and hard tangible paper printouts, and used to having these filing cabinets, and those days are slowly moving away, or sorry, quickly moving away. You know, you're moving away from that. And what a lot of people want to know is, well, how do I, you know, here's a good question for you. How do you create that culture? How do you sustain that culture? Well, I think HR Locker is one of the tools that you can use to keep the engagement going. And if you're an organization who, as you say, it's extremely cost effective, they do everything for you in terms of the training, and they can teach you how to do it. They can, they'll support you. And I think it's really interesting for organizations who think, well, it's not an option for us to allow remote working, when in fact it actually is. No matter what type of work it is, unless you're a customer facing role, you can get away with having some of your team rotating on a rota that saves maybe, like, I mean, there's whole organizations I know now who, and we've heard a few examples of it over the period of the last few months in lockdown, that have now decided that they're actually going to close all their offices and put people working remotely. Because you might look at that organization, if they're large enough, and say, well, they've got the money to spend on a software system that keeps employee engagement going, I can tell you, we can put information on the post once we post this, but we can put information out about HR Locker and what they can do for you. I think people will actually be stunned at how cheap it is actually, when you want to put something like that together, and it's highly commendable for Adam and the team for what they're doing for organizations.
There's a couple of things I want to come back on. First one I said about that sometimes I can be resistant to change. That is probably, in the whole course of my career, the one thing that I absolutely resisted, because I couldn't understand how you wouldn't have personnel files, how you wouldn't have that original document with the signature on it. And thankfully it never came to the bit where there was a head-to-head on it. I was kind of allowed to keep my personnel files. Now I look back on it and think, why, to send a letter out, you're printing it, you're signing it, you're photocopying it, you're putting it in an envelope, it has to go recorded, delivery. Now in HR Locker you upload, and it doesn't matter that I have signed it, the fact that it has come from my account into your system for you to sign it then is seamless. And I mean, the event that I had talked about getting the pop-up was a speaking event, a HR Locker speaking event that I was at. I don't think you were there, but Sean was there that time.
Yeah, I had to actually leave early, but I heard your talk actually.
And that was about remote working before COVID hit.
So strange.
I mean, like 2 weeks before.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Definitely no more than a month. Definitely no more than a month.
You couldn't have made it up.
I was talking about how, I mean, I use HR Locker in my business. I have one employee, so you kind of think, well, what do you need it for? And it tracks all the work that we do. Kira will clock in just so that I don't have to say, because I mean, her hours are fluid, depending on how much that work that I have on. So it tracks that. I send that straight to payroll, but it also tracks the projects that she's worked on. So from a costing point of view, I know exactly what Kira has generated effectively in terms of, so for that salary, here's the work that she has generated by client, and I can split that down and report on it. And obviously we work remotely. I'm based near Belfast, Kira's in the northwest, so we don't get to see each other that often. So the focus of that conversation was how in my business I can make remote working work. And we talked about Zoom. I was one of the trailblazers. I was on Zoom before. I have to say I've upgraded now, and I now pay for it purely because I see that that's the way my business is going to be. I did a grievance a couple of weeks ago. It was 2 hours long, and twice I had to get everybody to dial back in. It didn't feel terribly professional. For £120 or whatever it is, I'm sure I'd save that in car parking fees and travel anyway. So, but fundamentally, at the end of that, when we had the group discussion in terms of remote working, the biggest barrier that everybody saw was employers' trust in employees.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this hasn't been an ideal time to test how well remote working works, because ultimately if you have, and I'm going to be a bit sexist because I think the evidence shows that it was the women that were doing the majority of the homeschooling with their kids. So not only were they trying to work, homeschool, and ultimately childmind and keep the children occupied in some shape or form. So that did primarily fall to the female. And if that female is an employee, I'm sure there were employers looking and saying, every time I phone, the children are about. Well, of course they were. The schools were shut. Childcare was shut. That employee was never going to be 100% effective. But I would argue that people that work from home in normal circumstances will be much more productive, because, in my last job, I left the house at 8 o'clock, or I was supposed to be there for 9, and left there at 5, and it was 6 o'clock. Typically, if I work from home, I do 8 to 6 because that's what I'm used to being out. But I'm not kind of held to that. And if during the day I want to run up to the bank or I need to go to the dentist, well, you can fit all that in with the normal working day. But even having said all of that, I don't know of any clients who are saying no. When we get everybody, we want to get everybody back as soon as we possibly can, and remote working isn't going to be a feature of this business going forward. I think, you know, and in some cases, some clients are saying we're more productive separated. I still think there absolutely has to be a balance, and what I can see happening down the road is a lot of office space being vacated and a move towards shared office space.
100%.
So you might say book a large meeting room on a Friday afternoon and you get together with the team, and it's probably more just thrashing things out, doing business updates and heading to the pub or something after, and then just doing that bonding thing. But I think for those organizations that can do that sort of thing, I think it makes perfect sense to do it, because the employees are a lot happier. They're able to get on with their work. There's, you know, so much is going on as well around extended time. So they're maybe not doing their 9 to 5. They're maybe doing the childcare bit, or the husband's gone to work, and vice versa. And that person's working day might start at 6 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
But that can suit organizations, because if you have clients in America or you have clients in Dubai, different working hours then are really beneficial to the organization. Wow.
Yeah, I can't see how I can go back, especially when, and I know on the day at the event you're referring to that we were at, like, I remember we were looking at the likes of sort of Eastern European type countries who were looking at the 4-day model rather than the 5-day model, and how productive that had been for them, and how some of the bigger organizations here, like the sort of Fortune 500 or blue chip companies who were investing in Northern Ireland, they were already starting to look into these types of things. Like, I can give an example. It's a very good point that you make, because it's not, under the circumstances, it's not a great experiment to run during this time, because motivation isn't great in general and productivity. But Laura, for instance, my fiance, she would work from home more or less even before all this. She's in IT, so it makes sense. She was working home from at least 1 day a week. So whether that was 2 half days or it was 1 full day. So we already had a setup. We had a setup for both of us to work from home remotely. Thankfully, not everyone has that, and I appreciate that. But what she's finding is she's actually more productive, as you said. So she'll find that in her role, she's dealing with a lot of different departments within the organization. So a lot of people would be coming to her for information, and she's finding that the correspondence with those people is much quicker, because you can do it on Zoom, or they use Teams, Microsoft Teams, a bit more secure. And so she's doing what she's doing, but she's not getting interrupted just as much, and she's able to get more of her work done and actually manage those relationships with the different departments in a much more effective way. So coming out of this, and this is a discussion we have had, it would probably make more sense for her to be nearly full-time at home anyway. With maybe, as you say, 1 or 2 days per week where she's going in because there's a meeting and you need to come together, and a bit of team building. And you know, from the cultural, just to bring it back to the cultural perspective, because a lot of organizations have asked us this, and people have asked us this, like, how can we develop that? That's a great model that you just described there, using a tool that allows engagement to be ever flowing. The fact that we have technology, we can see each other's faces, it's not as good as being face to face. Of course, the exchange of energy and the feeling you get in the room. Yeah, 100%. But if you couple that with a very strategic and nice way of doing things, that once a week, when you do meet up, it's all step by step. This is what we're going to do for the week moving forward. But also, okay, let's do a bit of team building here. Whether that's going to the pub, whether that's having a conversation, some team games. I think that organizations can become much more efficient as a result of all this. You know. But I think we could talk we have in the past talked for hours on end about these sorts of things, and we're all very passionate about it. But we'll maybe put it to a hold, and I guarantee we'll probably have you on again asking you more questions, Louise. But
so many topics you can delve into, isn't there? It's just
there really is. There really, really is, and we love everything that you're doing, because we have such a close relationship with you, and we're always seeing the value you're adding to people. But for anyone watching, for a little plug, I suppose, if anyone wants to find out more information about you or Opal People Solutions, where can they find you, Louise?
Email louise@opalpeoplesolutions.com, phone 07525095277, website www.opalpeoplesolutions.com, LinkedIn, just look up Louise McGeady on LinkedIn or Opal People Solutions. You'll find me.
No, well, that's fantastic. Just before we close off, I know Sean will do that. I just wanted to thank you very, very much for taking the time. And it's always brilliant. And I can't wait until we can get our next coffee, which is face to face.
I
Have to pay for that one.
Louise, Jenny, thank you very much. We genuinely appreciate your time. It was a really interesting conversation. I hope it's really useful to the other people as well listening, that they can the best from it too. So thank you very much, and we'll chat to you soon. Okay. Guys, remember, engage, enable, empower.